محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Continuing our lessons on the subject of criticism and praise, Al-Jarh wa Ta'deel عند Salaf, by Shaykh Abdul Salam ibn Barjas rahimahullah. Last week we were speaking about some of the principles in relation to praise and criticism, and how praise and criticism applies to both books and individuals, and it can also apply to people of the past, people of the present. And we'll continue from the page where the Shaykh he mentions now, giving the example of criticism in relation to books. So we mentioned last week the example of Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, rahimahullah, and why the scholars they had criticism against him, despite the fact that he was well known. And he did a lot of work for the Muslims, and we explained the problems and the issues. Today he gives the example, the Shaykh, of the kitab, Ihya Uloom Deen, of Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. So he says, rahimahullah, Abdul Salam, an example of the books, books that have been criticized, is the book Ihya Uloom Deen. An example from the books is the book Ihya Uloom Deen, reviving the religious sciences, by Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. And this book has benefited many people of the nation, the Ummah. And it's a reference in terms of admonishments and guidance, and the likes of that for many, many Muslims today. And it's not hidden that many people preoccupy themselves with this book, praise it, and they praise it from this aspect. And they say, in praise of the book, that many people benefit from this book, and it has spread far and wide in the East and the West, and has become a reference for the people for admonishments and guidance. So they praise the book for these aspects, but they are mistaken in their praise. So here the Shaykh is going to explain to us this book that many of us we probably heard about, and we probably wonder what the ulama or scholars think about the book. Ihya Uloom Deen is probably the most famous book written by Imam Al-Ghazali. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, we're going to talk a little bit about his life and his stages he went through. But this book, Reviving the Religious Sciences, is probably the most important book or most famous book that he wrote. Even though we'll see that he has other books that are more famous, and definitely other books which are more reliable. The Shaykh then says, so as to not prolong the criticism and validation of this praise, I will mention now a letter or treatise written by one of the scholars, Shaykh Abdullah bin Abdul Rahman bin Hassan bin Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, who wrote a small treatise clarifying the condition of this book. And there was at his time a man who used to read the book to the congregation in the masjid. So the Shaykh, he wrote him a letter to rebuke him in relation to this book, and rather take another book in its place. And the Shaykh says that this Shaykh Abdullah bin Abdul Rahman, he said, referring to the book, that it's not Ihya Uloom Deen, it's Imatatu Uloom Deen. It's the death of the religious sciences, if you actually read the book. Now, before we get into it, we have to know a few things. Number one, the Shaykh rahimahullah, Shaykh Abdul Salam, he wants to turn our attention to the fact that there's some books out there that are good and some books which are not. And as Muslims, when we choose books to read, we have to know there is not every book you can pick up in the Islamic bookshelf and read it. Some books, they have in it mistakes. Some books may even have in it bid'ah, innovation, or even worse, kufr. And if a Muslim knows this, they have to be vigilant. But the Salaf, our pious predecessors, our scholars before us, they used to be very cautious when it comes to the books. Just as they were cautious about who's a good imam or shaykh to take knowledge from, they were cautious regarding the books, because the books are the products of the authors. So I'll give you now an example that the earlier scholars used to criticize certain books just as much as they used to praise other books. So for example, famous Imam from the scholars of Hadith, Abu Zur'a al-Razi, rahimahullah. He died 274 Hijri. He's a student of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, contemporary of Imam Al-Bukhari and Muslim, well known in the sciences of Hadith. He warned against a book at his time which is very popular, and in fact is a book, or the books of an author who was very known in his time, who was in fact one of the authors Imam Al-Ghazali was influenced by, as we'll see. Al-Harith al-Muhasibi. The author, his name is Al-Harith al-Muhasibi. And his books at that time were books about raqa'iq, heart softeners, or wa'ad, and admonishments. And this Imam, Al-Harith al-Muhasibi, even though he had with him benefit, he was warned against at his time. Imam Ahmad being one of the Imams who told the people not to benefit from his work, as it comes authentically in the Tarikh al-Baghdadi, Khatib al-Baghdadi. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah one day went to sit down and listen to Al-Muhasibi. And after he left, he said, the speech of this man does not resemble the reality of the speech of others. And he warned against his sitting. What was Imam Ahmad rahimahullah's criticism really? That Al-Harith al-Muhasibi, despite his fame, he used to say things that the earlier scholars didn't say in terms of statements which were the words of the Sufiya. Number one, he was affected by that. And number two, he went into a little bit of ilm al-kalam, we call today philosophy or rhetorical, I think philosophy is the best word translation maybe. Philosophy, al-falsafa or ilm al-kalam specifically. Now what's interesting about this, Harith Muhasibi, at his time, he was famous, Imam Ahmad warned against him, but later, his books, which had in it different kinds of reminders, they were not the way the earlier scholars would remind. Imam Ahmad's student Abu Zur'a al-Razi warned against his books. Pay attention. Warning of an individual, we already spoke about last week. But they're correcting the books as well. The Salaf, they used to do that. Here you can find Su'alat al-Barda'i. That's why it's a book about questions and answers on the science of Rijal. Al-Barda'i, who was a student of Imam Abu Zur'a, he says, I asked Abu Zur'a about Al-Harith al-Muhasibi and his books. And he said, be wary of his books, for they're books of bid'ah wa dalalat, books of innovation and misguidance. Alayka bi-athar, and upon you is the way of the narrations. For you find sufficiency in those, the books of narrations. Why is this important, this statement? Abu Zur'a al-Razi, he's not someone who was known to be overly critical. He was very just. Imam Al-Dhahabi praised him for that. He was a just person. But when it comes to the books which had mistakes, this is Bab al-Nasiha. The man is asking about the book, so he has to be honest. So this establishment, this statement or this narration from Abu Zur'a al-Razi, Su'alat al-Barda'i, question number 479, is a clear evidence that the Salaf, our pious predecessors, used to criticize books, just as they used to criticize Rijal, narrators or speakers. Imam Al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, in Siyar A'lam al-Nubana, he comments on the statements about Muhasib, and he says that imagine, the statement of Abu Zur'a, he said Abu Zur'a lived a long time ago. Imagine he read the works that came later, which are even worse. And he mentions some examples of those books, and one of them which we're talking about now, Ihya Uloom. He said, imagine he saw that book, and what would he think about it? Which is interesting to comment, because it shows us that the Salaf al-Salih, they wanted to protect the beliefs of the people to the extent that if any book had something wrong in it, they would make it clear. So people wouldn't just pick it up and read it. And you'll be surprised, as we'll get into later, why in such books the ulama had to go out of their way to mention them. Before continuing, it's also allowed in Islam, if a book has some mistakes in it, or has a lot of misguidance in it, it's allowed to get rid of that book. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, he writes in Turuq al-Hukumiyya, page 233 downwards, chapter, that there is no daman, there is no warranty or no liability في تحريق الكتب المضلة وإتلافها. There is no warranty in destroying the books of innovation or misguidance and getting rid of them, literally burning them. And he mentions a lot of narrations about that. And it begins with the Prophet ﷺ. Al-Qissa, many of us know a story. One day, one of the Sahaba came to the Messenger ﷺ with a piece of paper that had some ayat from the Tawrat and some verses from the Tawrat. And Nabi ﷺ, his face became red when he saw that, because it's a zaman in which the revelation is coming. And later Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned Nabi ﷺ, he had that page burnt, so that the Muslims wouldn't rely upon it and mix between that and the Quran. And as we also know, the Jews and Christians, their book, some of it is true and much of it is not. You have to have knowledge. So why I mention these points, criticism of books is something that happened in time of Salaf. So it's important to know the asl. It's not that somebody is criticizing a book, or some of the ulama, when they criticize a book, they're doing it out of the maybe jealousy or something like this. Right? Somebody might say, why is an imam going out of his way criticizing another imam's book? It's not that he's trying to get rid of the book, and in the sense that he wants his books to sell or something. It's because what's in the books, they have to also be in conformance with the Quran and Sunnah. Coming now to the biography of Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, there's a lot to be said about it, but we just want to mention one point. And it's important because even though we're talking about his book, Ihya, Uloom, Deen, it doesn't mean that our scholars, they don't have a balanced approach and a statement or opinion about Imam Al-Ghazali. He died 505 Hijri and is one of the greatest imams in the history of Islam. Fiqh scholar and Shafi'i madhab. He was Imam Al-Usul, Imam in, you name it, whatever subject you could think of. He had some kind of grounding in it. But what's important is Imam Al-Ghazali also had marahil. He went through stages in his life. It's very important to know. Why? Because Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah's life, the beginning of it, the middle of it, and the end of it, it's not all the same. Much of his opinions he held in the beginning and the middle were of opinions of deviation. Even himself recanted from it at the end of his life. As we're going to see now in some examples. And it's important to know that. Some scholars say he went through 4 different stages in his life. Others say 6. And the stages change with the change in his life, his position, and his opinions. And Imam Al-Ghazali in general, before his last stage in his life, he held on to the aqeedah of the Asha'ira. And he was a lot in philosophy, ilm al-kalam, one of the biggest. And you would say in his time, if not the biggest. A lot of which he recanted. And some of his contemporaries mentioned this point. And we have to mention this because we're talking about the book Ihya Uloom Deen. What stage did he write that book? This is the question we have to ask. Because some people read the book and they don't know when he wrote it. And they take it as if that is Ghazali's final manifesto, his final belief. And it's not. What's clear, Ghazali, he wrote this book Ihya Uloom Deen in the middle stages of his life before he fell into what was called the crisis of faith. Because we have to be very clear here. Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, with all the intelligence he had, and Ibn Kathir, he writes in his biography, Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, Imam Al-Ghazali was one of the most intelligent people. In every subject he spoke about, Adhkiya, the most intelligent person you can find. Yet he had doubts. Because of his excessive study of Ilm al-Kalam, he studied philosophy for 2 years in Baghdad. Until at one point he had so much shak, he had to leave his post in Nizamiyya, and he had to go for his famous Rihla to Jerusalem. It's very important to know this. And he's not the only one who recanted and made changes in his life after deep study of Ilm al-Kalam, philosophy. It's a big discussion that maybe one day we can get into. His contemporaries, like Abdul Ghaffar al-Farisi, Abdul Ghaffar al-Farisi is a contemporary of Imam Ghazali. He died 529 Hijri. He mentions at his end of his life that it was reported, and he's a witness, he met him. He said at the end of his life, he returned to the Hadith al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he used to sit with the people of the Hadith and review the Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim. And this was what he continued to do. And if Allah gave him more life, although he died soon after his journey with the 2 Sahihs, he said it would be easy to say that he would have completed that science of Hadith in a few days because of his intelligence. And Imam Ghazali wasn't proficient in Hadith beforehand. It's also mentioned by Ibn Kathir in his tafsir. So that statement of Abdul Ghaffar al-Farisi is mentioned by As-Subki in Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya. And Ibn Kathir also mentions his biography. At the end of his life, he returned to his homeland of Tus in Iran. And he remained in his home. And he planted a nice garden outside his house. And he used to recite the Quran and memorize the Hadith Sahihah. And some of the narrators, they mention of his life, he died with Sahih Bukhari on his chest. Why do you have to mention all these points, brothers? That's the end of Ghazali's life, not the middle. But Ihya Uloom Deen, what stage did he write it? In the middle. When he had problems, and when he had fell into serious things, as we'll see, of aqeedah issues, serious things at tasawwuf, yes, very much into Sufiya. Even, unfortunately, some of the statements of Ghazali's book, as we'll find out, it even has some of the kalam of the Batiniyya, right? The Batiniyya, the Ismailiyya, right? Those known for believing in ilm al-zahir wa ilm al-batin, esoteric beliefs of inward and hidden meanings in the Quran. So Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, had a Sunnah Jama'ah have a fair position with him. Some of the scholars, they say at the end of his life, Wallahu a'lam, if he completely returned to Ahl Sunnah. But Shaykh al-Albani, rahimahullah, beautifully, when they asked him, beautifully he answered, when they asked him the question about Ghazali, he said he was closer, he came away from what he was upon towards Ahl Sunnah. So he was like in the middle stage between Ahl Sunnah and Bid'ah. May Allah forgive him. So this is our stance at the end regarding him. And the reason I have to mention that is that many times you might find in our durus, in our sittings in the masajid, hardly you might hear people quoting Ghazali, except in some of his more higher level books, usul al-fiqh or fiqh. But you won't find, for example, mention in this book we're talking about today. And there's a reason for it. So I wanted to mention all that point so people can understand who Imam Al-Ghazali was and what the Shaykh is trying to say. Imam Abdul Salam here, what he's trying to say. Now, the Shaykh, he cites the treatise of Shaykh Abdul Salam, cites the work of one of the scholars of the past, right? As we mentioned, Shaykh Abdullah bin Abdul Rahman, from the great grandson of Shaykh Islam Muhammad Abdul Wahab. He wrote a letter about the book. So I'm going to read a little bit what he said in relation to the book Ihya Uloom Deen. And this is found in Majmu' al-Rasail wa Basail Najdiyya, volume 3, page 129. So the Shaykh, he writes, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most beneficent, all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, and the final outcome is for those who are pious. Until he says that verily there have been people in this time of ours who have been busying themselves with the book Ihya, and Ihya Uloom Deen al-Ghazali, and they read it to the public and the general masses. And these people are not proficient in understanding the meanings of that book, nor what the sentences and the structures entail of meanings, nor are they qualified to distinguish the falsehood and the right in it. And the Shaykh then says, so I wrote this nasiha to that person, that instead of reading this book, that he should read instead from the books found in the Islamic library. And in Islamic heritage, we have many good books. Books that have in it a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the biographies of the earlier scholars, the pious predecessors, the heart softeners and reminders. But the man who I wrote the letter to did not accept my advice. Rather, he continued his opinion, was amazed at his own self, and even belittled the status of the one who was warning him. And then the Shaykh Abdullah Abdul Rahman, he continues and he mentions, that is a bit long, but he mentions as he keeps going, why the book was warned against. Why was Ihya Uloom Deen, this famous book that we hear, what was the problem with it? He says now, and this is the point I want to get to, he says that some of the earlier scholars, they commented about this book. For example, he says, Ibn Aqil, famous Hanbali scholar, he warned against the book severely. And he even mentioned that in this book there is zandaqa, yani apostasy. Some of the statements within the book, if you were to read it, it's un-Islamic. And in point, even ulama Ibn Aqil went to the extent that he said whatever is in this book is kufr. Parts of it, na'udhu billah. Obviously, the ulama didn't make takfir of Imam Al-Ghazali, so we should not misunderstand that, but that's what was inside the book. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he said that Abu Hamid, which is the kunya of Abu Al-Ghazali, he entered into the subject of philosophy to the point that Ibn Aqil considered him from the zandaqa, those who had beliefs were un-Islamic even though they are Muslim. And he said he also refuted the many false interpretations of philosophy in the book. Shaykh al-Islam wrote about this in more than one place. But then Shaykh Abdullah, he brings a statement which is probably one of the most important here, which is a student of Imam Ghazali himself. And this is important. So it's not somebody from outside saying this. Take a look at this. Ibn Arabi al-Maliki. Many of us, we are familiar with the Uloom al-Quran. Ibn Arabi al-Maliki, he wrote the book Ahkam al-Quran. One of the best books about the subject of the Quran and the rulings. He's a student of Ghazali. He said, Shaykhuna Abu Hamid, he said, our teacher Abu Hamid, he entered into the very depths of philosophy, falsafa, and then he wanted to get out of it, but he wasn't able to properly. I'll repeat again. Our Shaykh Abu Hamid entered into the depths of philosophy, then when he wanted to exit it, he wasn't able to proficiently exit it. And the kalam ahlul ilm ma'rufun fi hada. And the statement of the people of knowledge in this subject matter or this topic is well known. And it doesn't become confused for anyone except for one whose opinion, one who has a very weak understanding of the knowledge of ilm al-kalam and is dangerous. What's important about that statement of Ibn Arabi? He's talking about his teacher, and later on Ghazali himself witnessed the same by leaving the subject of ilm al-kalam. Even though we're not talking about that right now, we're noticing a trend. That the subject of ilm al-kalam, the ulama, they spoke about it in a long, in-depth speech. And the Salaf al-Salih warned against that. Because of what it is and what it entails of argumentation which are not found in Kitab and Sunnah and the doubts they provide and they bring. And of course, the conversation about Ilm al-Kalam is absolutely haram. Is it allowed sometimes? Who is qualified? That's a bigger discussion. But we can see here, no one can deny the Salaf and the earlier scholars, including Ghazali and his own students, were cautious about that subject. So cautious because of what it does to the people who went into it. And it's not only Imam Al-Ghazali who finally repented from the statements or the act engagement in Ilm al-Kalam. For your own benefit, you can find also Al-Razi and his teacher Al-Juwayni and many others before and after who also repented and recanted from their view and their position or belief about the value of Ilm al-Kalam. It's also interesting to know that Imam Al-Ghazali in the beginning of Ihya, he says that Ilm al-Kalam, according to Imam Shafi'i, is haram. But then he also engaged in it. And even some parts of the book he might say opposite. Which is something you also would take into consideration. That sometimes the people of Kalam, they also have a lot of contradiction. I mentioned all of this point. The Shaykh has mentioned this point to let us know that the book Ihya Uloom Deen, despite the author's status as a scholar, the book was not a good book. And then the Shaykh continues to cite the statement of this Imam until he gets to, obviously, the point which is that this book is not something which the scholars advise, and it has in it, even though it has in it something of benefit, it has much more harm in it. So before continuing, we should also now mention that our scholars, when it came to talking about the subject of the book Ihya Uloom Deen, the scholars, they broke into three groups. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because somebody may come to you and say, well, brother, it's not true, all the scholars warned against that book. And someone will tell you, there's many imams who say good things about that book. Who would say, yes, there are some. But how do you understand that versus the criticism against the book? Because in Islam, we're going to learn today when we have criticism and praise, we have rules. How do we engage with criticism and praise? So some of the ulama, one group of the ulama you can say, they highly praise the book outright, without commenting on any mistakes in it. And that group, for the most part, are the people who either agree with Imam Al-Ghazali's initial aqidah or Ahl Tasawwuf, the people of Sufiya. And it makes sense, as Shaykh Abdul Salam told us, that everyone will support their teacher and their methodology. So they didn't talk about any mistakes, they just said that the book was very good. Until there's a famous statement, مَنْ لَمْ يَقْرَأ الْإِحْيَاء فَلَيْسَ مِنْ الْأَحْيَاء. Whoever didn't read Ihya, he's not from the living. He's not alive. These kind of statements are a bit over the top. Second group of ulama are those who ma'aridun, those who were criticizing in opposition to the book outright. And they knew the book has more harm than good. The nuqad, those who criticized. And we're going to mention some of their names. And they criticized the book so heavily that at one point, as we'll see, the book became banned. Right? In Maghreb and Andalus. In North Africa and Andalus, Ihya Uloom Deen was publicly burnt in a large bonfire. No one was allowed to read this book. The third group are the people in the middle, the ulama who recognize the good in the book, but also a lot of the evil. So there is some good, but the evil is much more. And that, from that category, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. Ibn Taymiyyah, he wrote a lot in criticizing Ghazali's book, and even commenting on Ghazali's beliefs and his practices. But Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, one of his hallmarks was justice. We spoke about last week the importance of insaf. Student of knowledge, a human being, a Muslim has to be just. You criticize in a fair way. So, not to say that the second category were not fair, but Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah saw that the book has some benefit in it, and he divided it into like portions. He said, in Majmu' Fatawa, that Ihya has a lot of fawaid, a lot of benefit. However, it also has a lot of blameworthy material. And he mentions, for example, kalam al-falsafa, speech about in philosophy, or ilm al-kalam, speech in relation to mistakes in tawheed and nubuwwah, prophethood, and mi'ad, yawm al-qiyamah. It has lots of statements about the Sufi of the past and some of their actions. And then the Shaykh also continues, says, but also there are parts in the book which have weak ahadith wa athar da'ifa, bal mawdu'a kathira. So many weak ahadith. In fact, as we'll see, some of the ahadith Ghazali mentioned, la asl lahu. No, there's no origin for them whatsoever. And then lastly, Shaykh al-Islam said some parts of the book, they mentioned the stories of the people before, those who were righteous, and the people of Sufiya, but their actions that they did were muwafiq the Kitab wa Sunnah, in ingredients to the book and the Sunnah. from etiquette, and from other things like this. And so at the end he says, due to this differing, or due to this, these three different parts in the book, you find a difference of opinion among some of the scholars in relation to the book. See, Shaykh al-Islam, what he did there, he let us know now why some people praised it, why some people criticized it. So those who praised it look from those aspects. Those who criticized it look to the other aspects. For example, those who criticized said the aqeedah mistakes, usuli mistakes in hadith. And those who praised it said the etiquette, the wa'ad, the reminder, etc. So we understand. Majmu' Fatawa, volume 10, page 551, 552. So Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he mentioned this, but he also mentions other things about the book. As we said, that he criticized the book as well. For example, he mentioned something famous about Imam Al-Ghazali. He said, Imam Al-Ghazali became sick by the book. He became ill due to the book of Shifa. It's play on the words, right? Amraduhu Shifa. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, Imam Al-Ghazali, he became sick because he read the book Shifa, which is the cure of Imam Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, he has a book called Shifa. So why is all this important? Ibn Taymiyyah's statement allows us to understand now that what Shaykh Abdul Salam is doing is not considered bad etiquette. Some people may even wonder, how dare anyone talk about Ghazali's book, right? Some may even come and walk in and say, how could anyone think that it's acceptable for anyone to, after Ghazali, to criticize his book? But we have to remember, before continuing, the ulama who criticized his book are ulama at the level of Ghazali. He's either his contemporaries or those after him who are imams likewise. So it's not like me and you are coming and saying something. But we also have to remember, last week we mentioned the hadith. Hadith Hudayfa bin Bukhari, a Muslim. The Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he told us at the end of times there will be callers to the gates of the hellfire, right? The end of that hadith. From this hadith we took a benefit. The ulama mentioned, like Hafid ibn Hajj al-Fath al-Bari, that this hadith teaches us that anyone who says something which is mistaken, no matter if they're a high level or low level, that statement has to be refuted. This is asl now. So the ulama who criticize Ghazali, they're not trying to say that they're like Ghazali in his knowledge or his wisdom. They're saying that the book has mistakes. Approximately 18 different scholars from past and present warn against the book. Some of those examples, Qadi Iyad al-Maliki, Qadi Iyad al-Musa, famous scholar of the Malik Madhab. Imam Ibn al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, in his Talbis Iblis, he has a whole section on it, even in English you can see. Page 276 of the English, for whoever wants to read. On his book, Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasideen. Imam al-Turtushi, rahimahullah al-Maliki, in his Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyyah al-Kubra, or in the Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyyah al-Kubra, it's cited that he also warned heavily from the book. And like I said, it got to the point that some of the scholars saw that the book had so much harm it had to be burnt. Ali ibn Yusuf Tashfin, who was the leader or the ruler of Maghrib and Andalus in the 6th century, and Hijri, he, based on the consensus ijma' of the ulama Maghrib, that they decided to burn the book. Ghazali lives in the east, or in the west, in the Islamic world. And those scholars who passed that fatwa, Al-Maziri and others, the reason why I'm saying this, that's the second category, right? But then, if we were to ask ourselves now, why is second category so strict in regards to this book? If Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah said there's some benefit, what's the harm of reading that book? The harm has to do with what is inside the book that Imam Al-Ghazali took from earlier scholars or added himself, and sometimes you may even wonder that if he was just borrowing some points along with adding his own things. So sometimes you may say that Ghazali, a lot of the things in the book were not his own statements, were quoted from earlier books. He relied upon the works of Muhasibi, the works of Abu Tayyib al-Makki, Abu Talib al-Makki, the works of al-Qushayri. So, I want to mention some of the things the ulama mentioned was inside that book, to draw our attention to the point that when the scholars criticize something, we have to trust them. Okay, this is the point we're trying to take, because it applies to anything nowadays. The only reason why we're using the book Ihya Ulumuddin as an example is a case study for us, not to say that the book is the only book criticized. We want to draw an example, as Shaykh Abdul Salam is doing, so we can learn later on that when we hear criticism, so-and-so scholar said this is not the best book, we should not be angry at that. Ulama, they know what they're talking about. Now I'll give you some of the examples inside that book that are considered very problematic. Number one, Imam Al-Ghazali, when it comes to the Bab of Tawheed and Aqeedah, Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, he only affirms 7 attributes for Allah. Which is the Aqeedah of who? Which madhab is that? Sha'ira. And he denies the Aqeedah or the Sifat ikhtiyariyah, Sifat fi'liyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first problem. So all of us, we know as Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has beautiful names and lofty attributes. Allah has infinite amount of names and attributes. Not only 7, Sifat Ma'ani. My brother Abu Fajr, he teaches on Wednesday in the Aqeedah that this is not the Aqeedah al-Sunnah. The Ghazali in that book, he lists only 7 and that's it. And then he makes ta'weer of other things and then he denies others. This is a problem, right? Because we know if I'm reading the book and I go to that part of the book, this is an Aqeedah issue. And for those who are not familiar with that chapter, you can read the books of Ahlul Sunnah Jama'ah about Aqeedah, about the names and attributes of Allah. Number 2, he defines Iman as statement and belief, and he doesn't include actions as part of Iman. So which group is that? Murji'ah. This is the Aqeedah Irjad. When we say Iman is 3 things, right? Belief in the heart, Iman on tongue, action in the limbs. Aqeedah al-Sunnah Jama'ah, Kitab and Sunnah teaches this. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, may Allah forgive him. Again, this is a book he wrote. Right? We say he recanted some from his position end of his life, so we hope, inshallah, these statements are not held accountable. But the book is there, it's present. And the book is translated, for those of us who don't know. Ihya Uloom is in 40 volumes, brothers. It's a big book. In English, most of it is translated. And so, we have to know this stuff because Ahl Tasawwuf, the Sufi, they make the book look like it's the best book. And like we said, after Kitab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, maybe Sahih Bukhari, if you ask what book, they might say Ihya Uloom. We tell them, subhanAllah, why is that book so high in your station, in your opinion? Also, the book has a lot of statements which are from the righteous before us, or from people of Tasawwuf, and a lot of those statements, Wallahu musta'an, are outrageous. You have to be frank, outrageous statements. And they're not statements anyone can defend. Mathalan, he has a statement of one of the Imams of the past, Abu Turab al-Nakhshabi, died 245 Hijri. Abu Turab al-Nakhshabi. He said, apparently, it's reported from him, Wallahu a'lam, bisihhati, that he said one day talking about, and some of his murids, we know the Sufis, they have murid, the seeker. He told some of his seekers, if you were to see, he said, by Allah, if you were to see Abu Yazid, which is another righteous man at his time, if you were to see him one time, it would be better for you than seeing Allah 70 times. Hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Pay attention, brothers. This is in print. This book, this is in print, these kind of statements. Allahu a'lam where it came from even. You were to see Abu Yazid was a human being, supposed to wali Allah. Better for you than seeing Allah 70 times? Outrageous, this kind of statement. Allah, forgive him. But this is the problem we have today, that at least we can see now that the magnitude of the statements of the ulama. One more statement, and he mentioned 2 more. Another statement in the book, he mentions a chapter that the music excites and arouses the soul more than the Quran. Ulama said, look at this statement. How, and he mentions bi'iddat wujuh, from different angles. Music excites the soul, arouses it more than the Quran. And we know Ghazali rahimahullah also held the view that music was halal, and that's in that book, Ihya Ulumuddin. In this kind of statement, some ulama said, I wish he never wrote something like this. Because now, imagine, me and you are going to go and tell somebody, please don't listen to music. At least thinking music's, mashallah, it's very helpful for my soul. And one more statement, and again, we're not criticizing the Imam here by mentioning these statements. We're trying to warn against a book that the Shaykh himself, even, we say that he, at the end of his life, recanted from a lot of what's in it. One more statement, Ihya Ulumuddin, volume 1, page 269. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he mentions in relation to some of the karamat, the miracles of the awliya, that it's possible that a wali can reach a station in which the Kaaba makes tawaf around him and visits him. This kind of statement anyone could take, that the Kaaba will come from Mecca, make tawaf around the wali, to the point even that it visits him. Hatta ba'dhum, they went so far and said, ijma', It's an ijma' in the Sufiya. If the Kaaba were to leave its place, you could still pray towards the Kaaba, where it used to be. And the karamat, akhiwan, we have a statement, when it comes to miracles, there's principles in Islam. This is not how it's done. And imagine how, when anyone witnessed this, the Kaaba left, waqt al-salaf, it didn't happen, and after. And this is important to know that these are issues, usul now. This is what I'm trying to highlight, usuli issues. And there's many more than this.